and he's a parishioner of St. Nicholas of Myra Church. And so please continue to pray for him. It's such a blessing for all of the men in our diocese who are permanent deacons, who are going through that and who are answering that call. So please also continue to pray for vocations from whichever parish you are in and from our entire diocese. You're listening to Divine Mercy Radio's Spring Care-a-thon. Pray, hope, and don't worry. We have our matching funds. And really quickly, I want to thank an anonymous donor who pledged $100. And with our matching funds, that's a $200 donation. So I think we're down to about $6,300 for our matching funds. If you could call in and help out with that, please call 785-621-4110. We're getting ready here to get on the line with Deacon Don Prendergast, and he's going to talk about the curse of Adam. And before we do that, I've got a few more announcements for you. We'll get to a trivia question, and then we will get him on the phone. 785-621-4110 if you would like to help donate. You can also go to dvmercy.com, and you can watch as the thermometer there. We try to update that daily. You can see where we're at toward our goal. But I can tell you this, that we need your help to get these matching funds used up. We have $6,300 in matching funds. Let's see if we can get a couple more donors, $1,000 donors. We haven't got that $5,000 donor yet from that I was asking about yesterday. So if that's you, call 785-621-4110. You're listening to Divine Mercy Radio's Spring Care-a-thon. Pray, hope, and don't worry on 101.7 KJDM Lindsborg and Salina, 105.7 KMDG Hayes, 88.1 KRTT Great Bend, 88.1 KVDM Hayes, 89.1 KGOH Colby, and 107.3 K297 AI Hill City. All right, let's get to our 8 o'clock trivia question right after I check and see. Deacon Don, are you there, sir?
Yes, good morning.
Oh, good. Good morning. We're going to get to discussing things with you here in just a minute, right after I do the trivia question. Okay, get those phones ready. 785-621-4110. Who adopted Moses and brought him up as her own son? Is it A, Pharaoh's daughter, B, Sarah, C, Ruth? Who adopted Moses and brought him up as her own son? A, Pharaoh's daughter, B, Sarah, C, Ruth. Call that number, 785-621-4110, to give us your guess. If you get it correct, we will put you in that drawing at 6 o'clock today for that last $50 gift certificate to Messenger, Traditional Catholic Books and Gifts here in Hayes. So call that number. Get your answer in, and it looks like Michael's been making it a little bit easier. He's down to making 3 choices instead of 4. Who adopted Moses and brought him up as her own son? A, Pharaoh's daughter, B, Sarah, C, Ruth. Call 785-621-4110. Okay, we now are on to our second interview of the day, and this promises to be another good one. So Deacon Don Prendergast was raised as a cradle Catholic, the youngest of 3 sons to a father who worked as a New York City firefighter in the 1960s. He served in the U.S. Air Force after high school and then worked as a New York City police officer, being promoted to detective before retiring in 2008. He has a Master's of Science degree in Urban Affairs from Hunter College in New York City, entered the diaconate formation in 2008, and was ordained at St. Patrick Cathedral in the Archdiocese of New York by Timothy Cardinal Dolan. He has been married to an amazing wife for more than 27 years with 8 children, of which 5 are adopted. He currently serves in active ministry in the Diocese of Orlando and working for an organization called Residing Hope formerly known as the Florida United Methodist Children's Home, where he is involved in direct care service for at-risk children. He started Through the Fire radio show and podcast about 1 year ago with his co-host and producer, David Fortin, where they seek to encourage Catholic men to fully embrace their God-given call to be men and fathers in the domestic church, as well as inspire women to support and encourage them, bringing out the very best that God has placed within their hearts. Deacon Don, it's so good to have you on here with us.
Well, thank you. That's quite an introduction. I got to meet that guy.
Me too. I'd love to meet this guy. I think we could sit and have a very good long conversation over a cup of coffee. So if he's ever in our area.
Yeah, really. I mean, it sounds very impressive. In actuality, I got to tell you, I mean, when you put stuff on paper, I guess it sounds impressive. But, really, each one of us are called by God to just live and think about the future and think about those around us and be not afraid. And, I just, my attitude throughout my life has really just been one of just trying to do the best that I can with whatever resources God has given me.
Yeah, that's such a blessing that you say that, because it is the work of God in all of our lives. And so whatever is accomplished, we know that it comes from him. I want to really quickly congratulate Emily Rife. Thank you very much for listening, Emily, a faithful parishioner out there at St. Nick's. So Emily wins the trivia question of who adopted Moses. It was Pharaoh's daughter. So congratulations once again. We will put you in that drawing for that gift certificate to Messenger later today at 6 o'clock. We're on Divine Mercy Radio Spring Care-a-thon. Pray, hope, and don't worry. And we're speaking with Deacon Don Prendergast, and he's going to be talking about the curse of Adam. But really quickly, before we get back to him, I want to thank St. John's Altar Society of Harrington, because they pledged $100 and they challenged other altar societies to call in. I love these challenges. Thank you, St. John's Altar Society, for that $100 donation, which became $200 with our matching funds. And for the pledge and challenge for other altar societies, please call in, make those pledges, 785-621-4110. Okay, back to Deacon Don. Deacon, we are talking about the curse of Adam. I see is the topic here. And I think one of those things that leans heavily into it is that Adam did not embrace his call to manliness like God asked him to, and he failed in his role. And so maybe we can start there as to, what does it even mean to be a man? What's biblical masculinity and what does it look like?
Well, Dave and I, in our show Through the Fire, we spend probably the entire, every program that we put forth, every show that we do kind of touches on this topic over and over and over again, because it's incredibly critical that we understand exactly what the biblical purpose is for our existence. Beyond the fact that, you take a look at the Baltimore Catechism, and God created us to know him, to love him, to serve him, and to be happy with him for all eternity. Beyond that, but to understand, okay, so while we're here in this life, what is it that we're supposed to be doing? And as men and as women, God has given us a particular job description. And for us men, there's an organization called the Kingsmen. The founder of the Kingsmen, wonderful guy. His name is Mark Hoke, and I've commented. I've told him to himself. I said, Mark, I plagiarize your work all the time. And so Mark brings forward a very beautiful understanding that as men, we are called to be leaders, protectors, and providers, not only just in our own families, but even in society, our extended family, so that's the whole idea, is as men, and it's so beautifully boiled down: leader, protector, provider. And so, it's easy for us to focus on the provider side of things. Okay, so I need to get a job, and I need to work and make money, and so that I could, have a house and all that stuff. Um, and
Yeah.
so providing is easy. Society kind of throws that in our direction. The accumulation of stuff, the whole worldliness side of things, where you take the job of provider and you go run wild with it. And then, as far as protector and leader, well, that's where we start getting into a little bit of a problem. Um, you know, what are we leading? Are we leading? How are we leading? And so God calls each one of us men to be certainly spiritual leaders of our family. If we take a look at all of the covenant relationships that God has made with humanity, the covenant relationships starting with Adam, and then, Noah and Moses and Abraham, David and Jesus, and then us, all of the covenants come through the men. And that's by design. I didn't design it. And, don't be upset with me that this is the way God chose to do it. It's the way he chose to do it. And so that it's just as simple as that. The covenant relationships, the leadership, the expectation of leadership comes through the men. It doesn't mean that women don't have an expectation of leadership. Certainly women do. Women have a very important role. Their role is one of support and encouragement, motivation. Why did God create Eve? It's very simple. God created Eve to be a helpmate, to be a support, to be in assistance with carrying out God's plan for humanity. That's why, Adam, named all the creatures. None of them were suitable. And then God cast Adam into a sleep and created Eve. And then he finally said, at last, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. And so leadership is incredibly important. And then through that leadership, protection. As men, we are the ones that, and this is like basic biology.
Yeah.
We're the ones that are supposed to defend and protect. As our wives are defending and protecting our children, defending and protecting the interior of the home, we are called to defend and protect the exterior. And so, when we talk about the curse of Adam, well, what is the curse of Adam? Well, the curse of Adam is failing to do that. And we see that in society. I've talked about this in the past, where you take a look at, the sitcoms on TV going all the way back to the 80s. The dumbest person on the cast is the dad in the show.
Yep.
The dad in the show is the one that everybody laughs at, everybody, makes jokes about. That character is the one that is the fool. And who is it that is the brilliant character? The irresponsible children. I'm not going to start naming particular TV shows, but I'm sure everybody can draw to mind a particular animated cartoon show where the father, drinks beer and acts like an idiot, and the reckless juvenile son getting in trouble all the time is the hero of the program.
Yep.
I mean, it's just emblematic of the downfall of the family, which of course is exactly what Satan wants.
Mm-hmm. You bring up so many points and so I'll bounce some things and some questions off of you then, because the other day I shared this story with my family. I saw this post about, I think this boy was around 9 years old. So not a very big kid. And his face was mangled. He had 90 some stitches because he saved his 3-year-old daughter from certain death.
Oh, I saw that.
Did you see that by that dog?
I saw that. Yeah, I saw that on the internet.
And so, yeah, I shared that with my family. I mean, I even teared up, when I'm telling my boys, because I'm like, boys, this kid gets it. Because his answer when they asked him, why did you do this? He said, I'm the big brother. If anybody has to die, it's gonna be me. I was like,
Yeah.
holy cow.
Yeah.
Like this kid just instinctively, because that's how God made us as males, but he took up the mantle of protector and did it at 9 years old. And I'm like,
Yeah.
why is that missing in so much of our society?
Yeah, I don't have an answer for that, other than to say, we are watching play out in front of us, the devil's plan.
Yeah.
We're watching that play out. It's really sad because what we seem to have lost, and I don't know when this happened. It probably happened even before I was born, but what seems to have been lost is a profound understanding that we're only here for a little while, and then we're going to pass through the doorway of death into life eternal. And how many of us spend even a little bit amount of time focusing on what that existence is going to be and whether or not we're properly preparing ourselves for that? And it doesn't mean that we have to, some of us are called to live a life of profound piety, profound public piety. Some of us are called to live that life. And, that's holy orders and consecrated religious. But for the average ordinary person, it's not like you've got to walk around with rosary beads in your hands. It's kind of hard to swing a hammer or, when you've got rosary beads in your hands. But so it's not like I don't want to give the impression that, that we should ignore the ordinariness of the life that we live now. It's a matter of attitude. It's a matter of disposition. How are we living this life? We can still have the barbecue and we can crack open a beer, and that's fine. But how do we present ourselves? How is our attitude lined up with our duty and responsibility as men? Are we going to ignore the fact that I have children, which means until my children are of mature adult age, I have a duty to provide for them. I have a duty, and it's not a legal, I'm not worried about child services. I'm worried about the judgment seat.
Yeah.
Because I've had this conversation. Currently, I'm involved in a master's program to be a mental health counselor. And I'm taking a class, law and ethics. And so these conversations come up. And I've seen same class, same conversation in different universities. And it's interesting how, depending upon the worldview of a particular university, you will get different answers. And so a secular university, if you ask the question, well, which is more important for us to follow, law or ethics? Well, a secular university will lean heavily in the direction of, oh, you got to follow the law. Otherwise, you're going to go to jail and you're going to be fined. But a university that has more of a Christian worldview, they're going to have a different answer. And I personally support that kind of attitude where the answer is going to be more along the lines of, yeah, you have to follow the law. That's important. But if you blow it on the ethics, yeah, you're going to have eternity to wrestle with.
Yeah, we are on talking with Deacon Don Prendergast about the curse of Adam. You're listening to Divine Mercy Radio's Spring Care-a-thon. Pray, hope, and don't worry. We're asking that you would partner with us. This is a great conversation already that we're having, but we are only able to do that because you guys are so generous, and we are on these radio waves throughout our 5 different stations here in Kansas. And so please help us to continue doing this. I'm so excited to get back to this discussion here in just a minute. But we need your donations. Otherwise, we can't do this without them. 785-621-4110. Let's use up our matching funds. Let's see if we can do it here before we break for lunch, which means that gives us a couple more hours. 785-621-4110. Call in with your donations today. We are talking with Deacon Don Prendergast. So, Deacon, I want to get back to you because I love just having conversations, bouncing questions off. But one of the things you brought up, as men, as protectors, it's not always just a physical thing. And I often go back to the sin of Adam and Eve, from where right before they sin, it says they're naked and unashamed. Right after it says they're naked and ashamed. And I've often understood that, obviously they're ashamed that they sinned, but their eyes are open to the availability of use. Before they sinned, they would have looked at one another in the eyes of God and understood each other's goodness simply as a child of God. After they sin, they realize I can take something from you just for my enjoyment. I can use the goods that God has created just for my enjoyment. And so I think this is another big part that maybe you could speak to is when we're talking about protecting the women in our lives, our wives, our sisters, our moms, those people who should be important to us. It's also, what are we doing to protect their dignity? Would you speak to that for just a little bit?
So when God created Eve, he created Eve to be a constant source of encouragement, a constant source of support. Now, who else is like that if not the Holy Spirit? When we think about the Holy Spirit in our own lives, the advocate. What is an advocate? Someone who's gonna guide you and encourage you and whisper gently to you a better path to follow. And so I would argue that the dignity that God has placed within all women is an extension of his own dignity. And the question becomes, do we recognize that? One of the other images that I think is really fantastic to look at is the painting in the Sistine Chapel that has Adam, where he's kind of laid back and he's naked and he has his hand forward and his fingers kind of dangling. And you have the opposite image of God the Father with the angels around. And what a lot of people focus on is his mantle. And the mantle kind of takes upon the shape of a human brain. And within the mantle, with all the angels, within that mantle, God the Father has his arm around a woman. And so the way that painting has been described, and I think it's a beautiful description. God has his arm around Eve. And here's what's really cool. If you were to draw a line between Adam's eyes and Eve's eyes, that line has to go directly through God the Father. And so we're called to look upon our wives, to look upon our daughters, especially as men. We're called to look upon women through God. And how do we view women? Do we see them the way the devil would want us to, as objects of sexual gratification? Or do we see them as opportunities of grace? Do we see the women in our lives as physical manifestations of the love of the Holy Spirit, the support of the Holy Spirit? It's a shame when society has done an amazing job of convincing women that their value is held within their physical attributes. And that's kind of where we're at, and it never works out. It never works out. I do not know of a single woman, I've never known of a single woman who is happy to be judged based upon her physical attributes. I've never known a single woman who is happy to be regarded useful because of her sexuality. What's baffling and what's so contradictory is, women will rightly say that they do not want to be objectified. They do not want to be looked upon simply for their physicality. But then at the same time, You have the fashion industry, the cosmetics industry, you have Hollywood, you have the music industry that is promoting exactly the opposite.
Yeah.
I was looking at some images on the internet, and it was a Catholic post. I can't remember where it came from, but it was beautifully done. It was an image of a tabernacle with a veil over it, and then there was another image of a chalice with the chalice veil over it, and then there was an image of a woman praying, wearing a veil, a chapel veil,
Wow.
and the caption underneath it simply says that we veil that which is holy.
Wow. That is an awesome visual for you to give us. I want to pause there really quickly. My goodness, such good things that Deacon Don Prendergast is helping us to reassess, especially as males, our call to masculinity, what that looks like, and how we should treat the women in our lives. You're listening to Divine Mercy Radio Spring Care-a-thon. Pray, hope, and don't worry. And I want to thank Michael and Dee Dee Brule, who pledged $100. That becomes a $200 pledge or a $200 donation with our matching funds. Thank you so much, Michael and Dee Dee Brule, for that $100 donation. We ask that you would join with Michael and Dee Dee Brule and call in today, 785-621-4110, as we are on this final day of our Spring Care-a-thon. Pray, hope, and don't worry. We are talking with Deacon Don Prendergast about the curse of Adam. And so we want to get right back into this. Deacon, I think that may be something you can help us to understand better than, and I really can't stand the word toxic masculinity. Because, well, in either way, it's not a good thing. So some people will use that as meaning, like masculinity is evil and we should just destroy it. And there's a lot of people in our society that want to do that. But also on the other side of it, if we're talking about males who don't know what true masculinity is and then are just objectifying females, if that's what you mean by it, well, that's not good either. And so instead of toxic masculinity, masculinity is a good thing because it was created by God. So what can we look to understand what is true masculinity? And can you maybe give us some examples from scripture too, as to who can we look at to live this out as men?
Well, looking at scripture, you can start and you can finish with Jesus himself.
Yep.
One of the things that comes to my mind is the cleansing of the temple. So Jesus cleansed the temple. Now, when you read through that story, it starts where, we all know the story. Jesus goes into the temple area. He sees all the tables, the money changers, and he sees, the sacrificial animals are being bought and, and sold and all that stuff. We see all that going on. And then the story continues. Jesus is seeing this. And then the way the story goes, and a lot of people skip over this really quickly, but the way the story goes is Jesus then fashioned a whip. Okay, let's just pause there for a second. So he fashioned a whip, and then he goes on and he starts flipping tables, and he's whipping the merchants to get them out. Okay, let's back up a second. Let's pause where it says he fashioned a whip. How long does it take to fashion a whip?
Yeah, it doesn't say he just turned and picked one up. He had to actually braid these cords together. It takes a while.
So, what are we saying? 5 minutes?
No,
10 minutes?
probably a lot longer than that even, yeah. At least a long enough time to think about it.
Well, you see, and this is the point that, we love to take a look at Jesus and think about the hippie, I love you, everything's okay, we're groovy, I love you just the way you are. We love to look at the hippie Jesus and ignore the just Jesus.
Yeah.
The fact that Jesus spoke 3 times more frequently about the pains and sufferings of hell than he did about the joys of heaven. We skip past that. We skip past the fact that a true understanding of the mercy of God would tell us that mercy is for here and now. Once we die, mercy stops and justice begins. We don't want to talk about that. We don't want to talk about the realities that the table is being set for each and every one of us, and we have to choose how we are going to approach this table. So if we get back to the idea that Jesus is fashioning a whip, so what does that tell us? That tells us he's sitting there. I'm sure he's sitting there in prayer, but he's not a wimp. He's not a wallflower. He's about to enter into battle. He's entering into battle in a very, very real way. There are temple guards standing around who have very real weapons. And he's about to enter, he's going to put himself out there. And he's going to enter into this combat, if you will, where he now is going to defend Dad's house. Just like as you described, the boy that was defending his sister. Jesus is now he's come to the place where this has to stop. And clearly nobody else is going to step up. He's stepping up. And so that's a perfect example of proper masculinity, righteous masculinity. When we see fathers in the news and in media who are defending their daughters because of issues related to school bathrooms and inappropriate behavior in the bathrooms, when we see parents that are getting involved with school boards that are promoting teachings that are absolutely contradictory to basic biblical teaching, this is proper, righteous masculinity.
Yeah.
We're not talking about, you're my wife, go get me a beer. That's stupidity.
Yeah.
That's absolute stupidity. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about, and I'm going to, we can even bring the women into this conversation, not just masculinity, but I would challenge every man to ask himself, what kind of man do I need to be so that my wife will serve me in the capacity that God has called her to serve, joyfully in that capacity? And for women, what kind of man do I want to have in my life where I will place my trust and my love and my body at his service? When we look at masculinity through that kind of a lens, when we recognize that to be a true man is to love as Christ loved. It says in Ephesians 5 very, very clearly. And I remember one time I was not giving the talk. Another friend of mine, another deacon, was giving the talk. He didn't do such a great job because he started going into Ephesians 5 and he started talking about, as Christ is the head of the church, the husband is the head of the family, and the wife is to submit. And he didn't do such a great job, and there were a bunch of very unhappy women in the room. But when we approach Ephesians 5 the right way, what we come to find is, yes, women are called to submit to their husbands, but they're called to submit to their husbands as their husbands are called to present themselves the way Christ does for the church. And how does he do that? He surrenders his own life for the sake of the church. And so as men, if we have the moral character, the virtuousness of living, where that we will present ourselves to our families upon the cross, if we will sacrifice and lay our lives down, the rest is easy. I mean, I can't imagine a wife that would not want to support and give of herself for a husband that will do that. And quite honestly, if perhaps that is not the case, where even though the husband is presenting himself and laying his life down in a holy and righteous way for his family, for his wife, and it's not recognized, well, I think then it's time for a little marriage counseling and to really dig deep as to what's going on there. But as men, this is what we're called to do every single day, not just on Mother's Day, not just on our wife's birthday. Every single day, we are called to have an attitude of sacrifice, an attitude of love, an attitude of devotion, an attitude of holiness. And the curse of Adam, as well as the curse of Eve. There's a well-known priest exorcist, Father Chad Ripperger, who speaks extensively on this topic. And so some of the things that he talks about is the curse of Adam, very simply, is effeminacy and irresponsibility. So effeminacy, when we relegate and let the women be in charge, that's not the way God set it up. When we just, what's the expression? Happy wife, happy life. That's effeminacy. I'm sorry, but that's effeminacy. We should be the leaders of our families, and then the irresponsibility. Oh, it's not my fault. It's somebody else did. I'm a victim of circumstances. Well, dude, pull yourself up by your bootstraps,
do something
look
about
to
it.
heaven, and ask for support.
Yeah. No, Deacon, thank you so very much. You're having a great discussion here with me, and I love it. I want to break in really quickly. We're going to do our second trivia question of the day. So call 785-621-4110 to get this trivia question. Here is your question. In the Old Testament, God answered Hannah's prayer and gave her a son, whom she dedicated to God and took to the temple to be adopted and raised by Eli the priest. What was the name of Hannah's son? Is it A, Joshua, B, Solomon, C, Samuel? Once again, what was the name of Hannah's son? A, Joshua, B, Solomon, C, Samuel. Call 785-621-4110. Also want to thank Sacred Heart Altar Society of Park. They answered St. John's Altar Society's challenge, and they also pledged $100. Thank you so much for St. John's for putting that challenge out, for Sacred Heart for answering that challenge. That becomes a $200 donation with our matching funds. Let's use them up. 785-621-4110. Back to speaking with Deacon Don Prendergast. So, Deacon, I'm so glad that you brought up Ephesians 5 because if anybody wants to, it was Dr. Brant Petrie. He did a great thing on this. And as you are speaking, you're so right. He was talking about how that word submit means under the mission. And the mission of the husband is the salvation of the wife. And so what wife would not want to submit to her own salvation? And so I'm so glad that you're bringing that up because also one other thing, and then you can give us your thoughts and help us even more understand this. The Knights of Columbus here years ago did a video series called Into the Breach. And one of the things that always stuck out to me was, as men, we are the first line of defense for our family. And so Satan is going to do everything he can to destroy that, especially through pornography. And then when he destroys that, when Satan comes after your family, he finds that there's no one there to protect them.
Absolutely. I mean, if we take a look at pornography, for example, what is that? When we think about pornography, and all of us are subject to it, more so obviously the men, but even women are subject to it. And really what the devil is doing with pornography is he's creating for the imagination a fantasy world. And this fantasy world playing on our flesh, playing on our imagination, our desire for satisfaction and praise and glory. The pornography plays on all of that. And what happens in pornography is, over time, the individual that is participating in it, well, actually, that's a whole nother thing. Let's just say the individual that's watching it, because a whole different thing is happening to the person that's actually performing. But for the person that's watching it, what happens over time is there starts to develop even like a chemical change in the brain where you are perceiving as normal and ordered what you see on the screen. And then as you start to see what's on the screen as normal and ordered, it no longer aligns to the reality of life. And so for a man that especially for a married man that watches pornography, what happens is you start to replace your wife and normal ordered sexuality with this fantasy. And the more you align yourself to the fantasy, the more you start to reject your wife. It's just the way that works. And so it's no surprise that the devil would use pornography. And let's face it, we see pornography everywhere, even in the most subtle of places. And we're all susceptible to its influences. And so as we start to see this switch, it's no surprise that, this is what the devil wants, because you destroy the family, you leave the children vulnerable. Now you start to conquer the next generation. And for those individuals that are participating in the performance side of pornography, it's not much different than a narcotic. I've unfortunately I've had on more than one occasion the opportunity to speak to individuals that have been in that world, and it becomes this poisonous drug, this narcotic, because there's a cyclical event, where there's praise and whatnot, and the money and the lifestyle and the accolades and this draw for popularity. But then at the same time, there's a self-hatred. So it becomes like it's almost like a narcotic that you're addicted to. You hate the drug, but you find yourself where you can't live without it. And for those individuals that have escaped pornography, both participating and viewing, the relief is tremendous. And more often than not, the escape is, through the power of Jesus.
Yeah, we are on talking with Deacon Don Prendergast about the curse of Adam and all kinds of things that we should understand about true masculinity, what it looks like, why it's a good thing, how to live it out. I want to thank Mary Gassman, who pledged $250, and Norma Pipkin, who pledged $250. Together, that's $500. With the matching funds, that's $1,000. And so I think we're down to probably around $6,000 in our matching funds. Actually, I think we're under that now. Probably around 5,800, maybe somewhere in there. So let's see if we can get those used up. Thank you so very much, Mary and Norma. We really appreciate it. Please join with them in our evangelization efforts and help us to stay on the air. 785-621-4110. We're speaking with Deacon Don Prendergast. So, Deacon, I want to get back to this because, as we were talking about pornography and this fantasy world, I think a lot of what is brought out in this and a lot of what has caused this is just this, the Gnostic heresy of the body is bad, or the body doesn't really matter, especially with a lot of the other issues that we're dealing with in our world, with so-called transgenderism and things like that. I think that's a lot of the problem, is not understanding that when God created us and it says he created us good, that means that our bodies are a good and are not to be abused. And so would you speak to that a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. And you can't talk about this topic without mentioning Pope St. John Paul II's teaching on theology of the body.
Yeah.
John Paul, in his Wednesday audiences, gave this wonderful teaching about theology of the body. And it's something that I don't think we talk enough about. The reality is that as John Paul had taught it, the reality is the human body only makes sense when you look at male and female, it only makes sense through the understanding of the sexual union of the husband and wife.
And that's basic biology.
Basic biology, absolute basic biology. It only makes sense when you think about that. When you come to understand, and of course, St. John Paul did a much better job explaining this than me, but when you come to understand that it is at the time of the sexual union, at the time of this marital embrace, that we as human beings, we are given the opportunity to cooperate and partner with the divine. If you really meditate on that, if you come to understand that in that sexual union, we have the opportunity to cooperate and to participate in creation of what was not previously in existence.
Yeah.
We have the opportunity to partner with God in creating life. There is nothing that a human being can do that's greater than that. To be able to partner with God Himself in the creation of life. Science has never been able to create new life. Never.
Yeah.
They've never been able to do what only God can do. And as people, as human beings, we have that opportunity. Why not? Why not, if you're the devil, corrupt that? If you really want to tick God off, if you really want to get under His skin, if you really want to thumb your nose, thumb into the eye of God, if you really want to stick it to Him, why not corrupt that which gives humanity the opportunity to, in a way, be God-like?
I'm so glad you brought that up
humans.
because, this is one of the things that I try to cover with I get to do marriage prep. And when we go, and I know this is a sensitive topic, but something that needs to be corrected is, contraception in our world today. So when you bring that up, I think one of the greatest affronts to males being who they are supposed to be and seeing true masculinity is contraception itself, because of what you just said. God allows us to be co-creators with Him. And through contraception, we fall into the devil's trap and say, no, this great, beautiful gift that you have given me, I disdain it. I will take control of it.
So there's another very good Catholic teacher. His name is Christopher West.
Yeah.
And Christopher West has done an amazing job. Thank God for the Catholic Church. I know nothing compared to these other people.
Agreed. Me too.
But Christopher, and the Catholic Church is so beautiful, and I'm so happy that I have this opportunity to talk to the audience, because what I would want to say to the audience that's listening is, when you open yourselves up to Catholic programming like this, you're going to open yourself up to a number of sources. I don't claim to know everything. I don't. I know very, very little. The little bit that I do know, I think I know it pretty well. Likewise, if you want to learn about theology of the body, Christopher West is your guy. So what Christopher West talks about, and this is a great example. He says, okay, imagine that you're going to have a wedding, and you're preparing for the wedding. And so one of the things that you do for the wedding is you send out invitations. So you send out invitations to everybody that you want to come to the wedding. Well, let's just say, for example, there was somebody who you don't want to come to the wedding. Would you consider sending that person a disinvitation? Can you imagine opening up your mailbox, seeing a wedding invitation in there? You open up the wedding invitation, and there's like black Sharpie. We're having this wedding, stay away. Can you imagine that? But that's exactly what happens when we use contraception. When we use contraception, we are basically saying, okay, we're going to have a union that is rightly ordered, where God is present. God will decide whether or not in 9 months you're going to name the product of that union. God's going to decide that. Because the baby is the gift. The baby is the gift from God. So God gets to decide whether or not you're going to receive the gift this time, next month, next year, whatever. God gets to decide that. But when we use contraception, we're basically saying we're having the wedding reception without the church. We don't want the church. We just want the party. We just want the fun. And that's where it becomes incredibly problematic. That's where it becomes diabolical. I was just having a conversation with my wife before we came on the air, and we were talking about how the devil influences ordinary people in seemingly ordinary ways. And one of the biggest things that, when let's say, for example, there's a family that I'm familiar with, and I'm trying to encourage them to come back to church. They say they're Catholic, but they don't go to church. And I'm trying to get them to come back to church. And there's an individual that's within the circle of people that I know, and they're not necessarily encouraging to go back to church. And I was having this conversation with my wife, and I was saying to her, it's not like the devil is telling everybody, worship me, worship me. That's really not what the devil necessarily does. What the devil does, more often than not, is tell everybody anything but Jesus. Anything. You don't go to church, work an extra shift. Don't go back to Christ. Focus on this charity group. I mean, it doesn't have to be set up a satanic altar and do animal sacrifices. It doesn't have to be that. It's very simple. Anything but Christ. That's really, in a very simple way, that's the devil's tactics. Anything but Christ. And we see that in the family life when sports take precedence over mass. We see that in family life when, we're going to dump all this money into a vacation that we really can't afford, but it's so much fun. Now, I, as a father, have no time for my family. We see it in all these ordinary ways. But if we roll everything back and we take a look at how God has intended the family to function, intended men to behave, intended women to behave. Father Chad Ripperger, he talks about how modern feminism is the perfection of the curse of Eve, where women want to do everything, control, have power, have influence, and then they wonder why there's not satisfaction in the home. And men, the curse of Adam, allowing all of this to happen, ignoring the structure that God has set up for us.
Wow. Thank you so much. Let us take a quick pause there. I want to remind everybody that you're listening to Divine Mercy Radio's Spring Care-a-thon. Pray, hope, and don't worry. Having an amazing conversation with Deacon Don Prendergast. I'm going to read our trivia question one last time. We're almost up for the hour, but you have just a little bit to get your answer back in here. Call 785-621-4110. In the Old Testament, God answered Hannah's prayer and gave her a son. What was the name of Hannah's son? Was it Joshua, Solomon, or Samuel? What was the name of Hannah's son? Was it A, Joshua, B, Solomon, C, Samuel? Call 785-621-4110. All right, back to our last 10 minutes with Deacon Don Prendergast. So, Deacon, maybe some of the things that you can help us then to wrap up today. I know I think you and I could sit down for about 5 hours and have a discussion, which would be great. So we're going to have you back on, but a couple of things and then your thoughts on it. So one, our world also has messed things up because, our world has made its own view of masculinity. Like, oh, well, if you don't like baseball, then you're not a real man. If you don't do this or such, or if you can't grill a good steak, you're not a real man, and so that's not true masculinity. But also we don't want to fall into effeminacy. So how do we understand maybe true masculinity through the examples of the saints, while also not falling into the traps of society saying, well, if you don't do this and this, you're not a man, and then also not falling into effeminacy?
So one of the things that I would remind everyone of is the early evangelization of the church. when we take a look at the evangelization of the area that we live in, the United States, the group of priests, the early Jesuits were the ones that came over here. There were others as well, but one of the stories that I'm reminded of is the conversion of Kateri Tekakwitha, which is up in New York. She's now Saint Kateri Tekakwitha, and I believe she was an Iroquois, a Native American, and she was forbidden from being involved with Christianity. And the two Jesuit priests, they ended up being killed. They were martyred, and she was stricken with smallpox. And even though she was suffering, and she was forbidden from praying and forbidden from practicing Christianity, what she did was she gathered up stones in the forest, and she laid the stones out in the pattern of a rosary, and she would walk the stones. She would walk the stones and she would pray. Eventually, she was moved from Fonda, New York, and she was moved up into Canada, and that's where she died. And at the moment of her death, all the scars from the smallpox that were on her face and her body miraculously vanished, and she died beautiful. And so her example is what I turn to over and over and over again. And the example of the priests, that the missionary priests. When we understand, and here's what I guess my point is, when we truly understand what is at stake, when we truly understand what is written within the words of the Bible, then there is nothing for us to fear. There's no ego. I don't care what you think of me. It's not about me. John the Baptist, I must decrease so he can increase. That's true masculinity. True masculinity is a life of service. True masculinity is not impressing people. It really isn't. I couldn't care less. When Jesus died on the cross, he was not wealthy. He was certainly not popular. That's the life that we're all called to live. And so what I would say is, when we're thinking about our radio show, Through the Fire, and the tagline for the radio show is giving men the tools they need to build the domestic church and the spiritual weapons to defend it. It all comes from within. It's an attitude. I've spent a little bit of time reading about the Stoics, and there is a Christian stoicism where stop letting your emotions drive your actions, because the demons, the devil, Satan, they can manipulate your emotions. They can bring stuff from way in the past and bring it forward and throw it up into your mind's eye and make you think as though, oh, you're no different than you were before. Remember when you were a sinner? Just get back to the good old times and the fun times. So there's a lot of manipulation, a lot of supernatural manipulation that can take place by the diabolical that we have to be aware of. But to live a modern life of spiritual martyrism, to be a martyr for this world, this modern world. And I'm not saying that modernity is entirely bad. It's not. We've got a lot of very good stuff. Having clean water is a good thing. But to believe as though this is all there is, that is what's dangerous, because that is what leads everyone off the rails. And so, like I had said, it's a blessing to be on this program with you. I strongly encourage all Catholic men and women to utilize the resources that the church has. This radio station is one of them. The programs, Through the Fire, hopefully it gives people encouragement. It gives men a little bit of direction, maybe a little spiritual direction, because that's kind of what we're focusing on. to encourage men that, you know what? Jesus wasn't popular. Jesus wasn't wealthy, but everything that he did, everything that the apostles did made a difference. I had a friend of mine, and I'll finish with this friend of mine who was born Catholic but fell away. And as he was wrestling his way back to the church, he said to me, and this is a little bit apropos because we're moving on to through the season of Easter. He said to me, he goes, something had to have happened in that upper room where the apostles were hiding for fear that they were going to be killed next. And something must have happened that was truly profound, because on Pentecost, they burst open those doors and they were no longer afraid. And that something we know is Jesus and the Holy Spirit. And if it can work for them, it can work for all of us.
Absolutely. Deacon Don, thank you so very much for your time, sir. We appreciate having you on. We appreciate being able to play your show. Pray for us. We'll be praying for you.
Thank you very much. God bless you all. Blessed Easter.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. All right, we were on talking with Deacon Don Prendergast. With all of our shows, if you missed them and you want to find them again, you can go to YouTube and find them there. And then the ones that are on Skype, where do we find those ones at? Do we post those somewhere? Okay, they're on YouTube also. Okay. So even if it was a Skype call, you can go on YouTube. You can listen to those again. And I want to thank